Good evening and welcome. My name is David Langstaff. I'm Executive Vice President of the Institute. I oversee the leadership programs, our seminars and our fellowships, and our newest one, which was founded by David Brooks, which is Weave the Social Fabric. I'm here to introduce David. We are in for a treat. You know him as a writer with the New York Times, with the Atlantic, perhaps PBS NewsHour, and I hope many of you know him from his books. And if not, you should go get his books. There are a lot of people we can read. There are a lot of people we can listen to. But honestly, there's only one David Brooks. So it's my pleasure to introduce David Brooks.
Thank you, David. I hope you were all at the bar before coming in here. This will begin to, oh, here we have some wine over here already. This will begin to make sense depending on how many you had. So I used to teach, I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. So I taught at Yale for 20 years, and I taught a course, the course had different names, but the students called it Therapy with Brooks. Because basically all I did, we spilled our guts to each other as a way to get to know one another. And that's sort of what I do on an annual basis here. So I come here, I've been coming here probably for 20 years, and I give one talk, and it used to be the things I'd been thinking about the previous year. And now it's because I'm become a more middle-aged, emotional, addict. It's become the things I'm feeling over the last year. I know you want to know my feelings over the last year. And so I appreciate you all playing the role of therapist for me as I go through what I've been thinking about and feeling about. Some of you may have seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof. And if you saw that movie, you know how emotionally warm and filled with music and joy that Jewish families can be. Now, I come from the other kind of Jewish families. And so our culture was think Yiddish, act British. And it was super stiff upper lip. And so around the dinner table, we had conversations about the history of Victorian funerary monuments, the evolutionary sources of lactose intolerance. I'm not kidding, actually. There was love in the home, we just didn't sort of express it. And so when my nursery school teacher was telling my parents about 4-year-old David, she said, David doesn't really play with the other kids, he just observes them. And which is a good role for being a journalist. I always say, if you're the kind of person when the football team does the wave and you don't do the wave, you just sit there, you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist. And so I went into journalism, and I started writing when I was 7. I read a book called Paddington the Bear and started writing every day. And my values were really built around this intellectual atmosphere. And I tell the story, in high school, I wanted to date this woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that's where my values were, super intellectual. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And my favorite saying, which I say all the time about Chicago, the thing everybody knows about University of Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. But my favorite saying, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so it's pretty heady. And then if you had known me, I think 10 years out, you would have thought I was a pleasant enough guy, but maybe a little distant. And if you had tried to confide something into me, you would have found myself staring at my shoes and trying to keep an appointment with my dry cleaner. I was sort of a escape artist. And so, it's the normal thing, a fear of feelings, fear of intimacy. But mostly I just didn't know what to do. When the intimate and close and emotional conversations came up, I just didn't know what to do. And so there's this episode that happened in my life probably about 20 years ago that symbolizes this part of my life. So I'm a big baseball fan. I've been to thousands of games. I've never got a foul ball. And I'm sitting at Camden Yards with my youngest child, and the batter loses control of his bat. It helicopters into the stands, and it lands at my feet. Now, getting a bat is 1,000 times better than getting a ball. And a normal human being would have picked up the bat, stood up, high-fived everybody around him, celebrated with his trophy, become a Jumbotron celebrity. I just sat there looking straight ahead. And I look back on that moment and think, show a little joy. But I was like an emotional head of cabbage. And so I go into journalism. I get a job at the New York Times. I tell this joke that I was hired as a conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I get a job on TV, but not the emotional sort of showy kind, but the cerebral news hour, PBS NewsHour. And the joke I tell about that is we have a certain demographic that watches our show, that if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And I am not lying. My wife and I were walking in the Hotel Jerome, and an elderly lady came up to me and said, my mother loves your show. And I thought she was referring to my joke, but no, it was real. She was... So you go, but you have it, you go through an emotional journey. And, fatherhood softens you up. You suffer from the slings and arrows of life, and you get a little softer, and things begin to happen. Now, I'm a pundit, and another episode symbolizes for me a little shift. So I'm a political pundit, and I often sit on panel discussions in Washington, D.C. A friend of mine over there organizes a lot of these panel discussions, and Washington, D.C., we talk about fiscal policy like it's emotional. And so Washington, D.C. is the most emotionally avoidant place on the face of the earth. We just don't do it. We talk fiscal policy. But I was, Meg Greenfield famously said that Washington is not where the kid who put the cat in the dryer went to live. It's the kid who tattled on the kid who put the cat in the dryer. And so that's Washington. And so I was invited by the Public Theater in New York to do a panel discussion. But it was not like Washington, it was theater. It was theater people. And so like Anne Hathaway was there, and this great clown named Bill Irwin. We're backstage, we do a group hug, and then we charge out there. There's tissues in case we start crying, and then other people start emoting things, and Anne sings a song, and then I start emoting things. And as Samuel Johnson would have said, it was like watching a walrus try to figure skate. It wasn't good, but you were impressed that you were seeing it all. And so I came off, and then we got off the stage, we did a group hug, and it was like, we were so intimate with each other. And I thought, I got to move to New York and do more of that. And so I began to do the University of Chicago thing. I wanted to get more emotional, so I wrote a book about emotion. And then I wanted to learn about moral growth and moral character, so I wrote a book about character called The Road to Character. And I learned in that process that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. But I tried to make myself more emotional. And I'm not necessarily a noble person, but I'm a grower. I do change. And I have proof of that, but it involves more name dropping. And so I've been interviewed by Oprah twice, 4 years apart, Super Soul Sunday, if anybody watches that show. And after the second interview, 4 years later, after we're done taping, she says to me, David, I've never seen anyone change so much. You were so blocked before. And she should know, she's Oprah. And so my story is proof that you're never too old to change, that change happens through the lifetime. And I think one of the things that's changed is I just want to show up better for people. And I used to want knowledge, now I want wisdom. And wisdom is not knowledge about things, it's understanding of people. And so I think that I've oriented my life in that direction. So I want to show up with people. And life happens in ways that sometimes calls upon you or gives you the obligation to show up to people well. And so I'll tell you a story about a time I tried to show up or learned about showing up people well. My oldest friend in the world was a guy named Peter Marks. We met at age 11 at a summer camp in Connecticut, and Pete was a handsome, strong, athletic, kind of an exuberant goofball. I remember one moment when we're like 16, he's skipping around the dining room, big athletic guy. He's skipping out the doorway, but he skips but 4 feet in the air. He smacks his head on the top of the door frame and then smack down on his back. And we're 16-year-olds. We found this hilarious. He was 16. He found it hilarious. And that was sort of the goofball of Pete. And so we built our relationship based on play. We played rugby, we played basketball, we played sports. We would turn eating into a form of play. And as the years went by, Pete did well. He joined the Navy, he went to college, he became an eye surgeon. And my wife, who's here somewhere, had a phrase that describes Pete just right. He was a rare combo of the normal and the extraordinary. He was masculine the way you're supposed to be masculine, with great tenderness and strength. A father the way you're supposed to be a father, with devotion, fun, and pride. A husband the way you're supposed to be a husband, lucky enough to go home to the dinner table to be with the person you most want to be in the world. He seemed outwardly like the most blessed person in our circle. Cheerful disposition, great marriage, wonderful kids, a job he loved. 2019, we went up to see him, and a light had gone out in him. And my wife noticed it immediately. And what had happened was he had been hit by depression. There was a flatness in his voice, a stillness to him. We were doing the things we always did, played basketball, swimming in the lake, and he could find none of it enjoyable. At first, I didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. I didn't understand depression. I had some contact with it, but not this deep. And over the next months, severe depression was revealed to me as an unimagined horror. I learned that those of us lucky enough not to have been hit by depression cannot understand it by extrapolating from our moments of sadness. It's an entirely different beast. The novelist William Styron wrote brilliantly about it in a book called Darkness Visible. He said, madness of depression is generally speaking the antithesis of violence. It's a storm, but a storm of murk. Soon evident are the slowed down responses, near paralysis. I experienced curious inner convulsion that I can only describe as despair beyond despair. I did not think such anguish was possible. So during COVID-19, Pete and I would speak by phone. And I tried to give him suggestions of how to get out of depression. And so he had earlier, as an eye surgeon, he had gone to Vietnam and given people cataract surgery. He found it tremendously rewarding. So I told him, you should go to Vietnam, you should go do that kind of service, you'll find it rewarding. It was only later that I learned that when you tell a depressed person advice on how to get out of depression, the only thing you've done is show them you don't understand their situation. The second thing I would do, I would try to remind him of all the wonderful blessings of his life, of his family and his job. And I learned later that when you tell people who are not enjoying what is palpably enjoyable, that they should enjoy that, again, you're just making them feel worse. So I tried to use words to cheer them up. And I worked with words all my life, but quickly learned that words were useless in these circumstances, and the feeling of impotence was existential. I learned very gradually that a friend's job in these circumstances is not to cheer the person up. It's to acknowledge the reality of their situation. It's to hear, respect, and love them and show them you'll be with them on the other side. And I wanted to just show them that I saw him, but it took me a long time to realize that, just to show them there's less alone. Perhaps the most useful thing I did for Pete was to show him a video of a sermon that was given by another friend of mine who suffered from depression, a guy named Michael Gerson. He gave a sermon at the National Cathedral discussing his own bout with depression. He described depression as a malfunction of the instrument we use to determine reality. And that really resonated with Pete. Mike talked about the obsessive compulsive voices that tell you lies. That no one would miss you if you're gone. That your life is worthless. And so I wish I had bombarded Pete with more just constant touches, just an email. No response necessary. There's a phrase I came across from Balzac, the French writer. There are moments in our lives when the sense of our friend is near is all that we can bear. Our wounds smart under the consoling words that only reveal the depths of the pain. Now, Pete was always the braver of the two of us, that he was the one leaping over campfires, cliff diving, and he fought depression for 3 years, hour by hour, day by day, for over 1,000 days. He took his life about a year ago. And I don't know what he was thinking on his final day, but knowing Pete, I think he was thinking that he was doing his family a favor, that he was ridding them of the pain that he was suffering and what he was causing them. And I can tell you, if you ever find yourself catching that or having that idea that you're going to do somebody a favor by getting out of their life, I can tell you that's completely wrong. And so he took his life. His death disoriented me. When I came out here, I had the sense, because we'd known each other since we were 11, I had the sense that it's like coming out to Colorado and suddenly the mountains are gone. Because a relationship that had been all life was suddenly gone. And so it was a hard education in how not to show up for somebody, and then education in how to show up for somebody. And I learned, one of the lessons I learned was that recognition is the first human quest. Whether they're going through good times or hard times, people need to be recognized. Babies come out of the womb looking for a face to see. And I don't know if you've ever seen these experiments that psychologists do called the still face experiment. When the mom doesn't show any emotion, when the baby makes a bid for attention, at first the baby fusses, then panics, and then collapses into misery. And that's true of all of us through life. Non-recognition is not only devastating for babies, it's devastating for all of us. George Bernard Shaw said, "The worst sin toward our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but to be indifferent to them." That's the essence of inhumanity. And so we live today in a society that doesn't see a lot of people. And this is what I see in my career as a journalist. Midwesterners feeling the coastal elites don't see them. Blacks feeling their daily experience is not understood by whites. Teenagers feeling that no one gets them. Republicans and Democrats looking at each other in blind incomprehension. Husbands and wives realizing the person who should know them best actually has no clue. And I don't need to cite to you all the statistics: depression rates, suicide rates rising. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends has gone up by fourfold in the last 20 years. 54% of Americans say no, that no one knows them well. 48.9% of teenagers say my life is not useful, I do not enjoy life. And so both the personal experiences and the social experiences have reinforced in me the belief that there's one skill that lies at the heart of any family, healthy family, organization, company, or nation, and that's the ability to see others deeply and be deeply seen. It's to make other people feel recognized. And this is not only a social challenge for us, but it's a moral challenge, and maybe the essential moral challenge. We think about morality sometimes as following commandments and rules. We think about morality as being heroic. Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Bryan Stevenson. And those are indeed forms of morality. But for most of us, being a better person, being a moral person, is not heroic, and it's not about following rules. It's every day. The philosopher Iris Murdoch argued that morality is something that goes on continuously in the seemingly uneventful happenstances of life. The essential immoral act is not seeing another person in self-serving ways as a character in our movie. And we often don't see others because we're too egotistical, we're thinking about ourselves. Or we're too anxious, we got too much going on up here. Or we're too self-centered. We're just thinking from our perspective. Somebody told me about a story of a guy who's on one side of the river and he sees a woman on the other side of the river, and the woman cries out to him, "How do I get to the other side of the river?" And he says, "You are on the other side of the river." He can't see from her perspective. So most of the time, Iris Murdoch said, morality is the skill of being considerate toward other in the complex circumstances of life, welcoming a newcomer into your group, detecting anxiety in somebody else's voice, asking what's wrong, knowing how to host a party so everybody feels included, knowing how to break up with somebody without crushing their heart, knowing how to ask for forgiveness. These are skills. Nobody's born with these. They're skills that have to be taught and mastered. And so in every community I've learned, there are some people who are illuminators and some people who are diminishers. The illuminators make you feel seen. They're just curious about you and you love being around them. And other people are diminishers. They stereotype and they ignore. There was a novelist named Ian Foster who wrote about 100 years ago, His biographer said of him, to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity that you had to be your most honest, sharpest, and best self. How good would it be to be that guy? There's a story told about Jenny Jerome, who was Winston Churchill's mother. When she was a young woman, Jenny Jerome found herself seated, and this is 19th century England, next to the Prime Minister William Gladstone at dinner. And she left that dinner thinking that Gladstone was the cleverest person in England. A couple weeks later, she's seated in dinner next to Gladstone's great rival, Benjamin Disraeli. And she left that dinner thinking she was the cleverest person in England. So it's good to be Gladstone, it's better to be Disraeli. There was famous labs, Bell Labs, and they had the researchers. Some of them were much more productive and creative than the other researchers, and they want to know, why are these researchers so much more productive than the others? Was it their background, their education, their specialty? They couldn't find the reason. Then they find out the most productive researchers were in the habit of having lunch or breakfast with an engineer named Harry Nyquist. Harry Nyquist really listened to their problems, walked through their problems, and gave them solutions. And so those are eliminators. And so to grow and to be a better person, we want to practice those skills. So what are those skills consist of? Well, the first skill of being an illuminator is the gaze, eye contact. When I'm meeting you, you're asking certain questions of me unconsciously. Am I a person to you? Am I a priority to you? And the answers to those questions are given by the eyes before the mouth is even opened. And so you want to have a gaze that's warm and welcoming. About 2 years ago, I was in Waco, Texas, and I was at a diner having breakfast with a weaver, one of our weavers, and she was a 93-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey. And she had been a teacher, and she was a tough drill sergeant type. She told me that I love my students enough to discipline them. And she intimidated me. And a mutual friend walked into the diner at breakfast. He saw both of us. He walked over to Mrs. Dorsey, grabbed her by the shoulders, and shook her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he said, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best. I love you, I love you. And her whole face turned from drill sergeant to bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. And the lesson of this story is you should gaze at people the way this pastor, Jimmy Durrell, did, not the way I did. Now, the simple version of that is that Jimmy's a more boisterous, big personality. He's a wonderful guy. The homeless people wouldn't come to his church, so he moved his church to the underpass in Waco, where the homeless people live. It's called Church Under the Bridge. He's a wonderful guy. And he'd known Mrs. Dorsey for years, so of course he's going to be more intimate with her. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. And I'm going to make a point which is going to sound religious, but I don't mean it to be. Jimmy's a pastor, and so when he gazes at Mrs. Dorsey or anyone, he's seeing someone made in the image of God. When he's gazing at her or anyone, he's looking a little into the face of God. When he sees her, he's looking at somebody with a soul of infinite value and dignity. He's looking at somebody so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you can be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist or whatever, but having that kind of respect for every person you look at is the absolute prerequisite for seeing people well. That everybody is of that infinite value. It's just a generous way of paying attention to people. There was a guy named Ludwig Gutmann who was a German Jew, fled Germany during World War II, went to England and was a doctor. He served in the hospital where a lot of the paraplegic men who were injured in the war went. And before he got there, they just drugged the guys up and they basically treated them like vegetables. He took them off medication and started throwing balls at them. And they pulled him before a review board and they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, how do you see these men?" And the other doctors said, "These are moribund cripples." And Gutmann said, "No, these are the best of men." He just saw them differently. And he started what turned into the Paralympic Games, which still exists today, because he saw them differently. The second skill, after the gaze, is the first. The second skill is a skill of accompaniment. Now, accompaniment we think of in the role of music. The pianist accompanies the piano. When you're just hanging out, most of life is just hanging out. And when you're accompanying someone, it's an other-centered way of being. You're playing the piano to make the singer shine. And so it's just a way of thinking, this person is here, I'm just going to be willing to go where they take me and let them be who they are. And accompaniment is very patient. I have a friend who has a phrase, we like people who are lingerable, people you just want to linger at the table with. And that's the kind of patient accompaniment. Accompaniment is also playful. We're at our most genuine self when we're playing. And it's amazing how well you can get to know somebody just playing. When my oldest child was born, he was born in Brussels, and we played. He woke up, unfortunately, at 4 in the morning, and it doesn't get light in the wintertime in Brussels till 9 in the morning. So we had 5 hours of play every morning. Most of the play involved me trying to take a nap while he thought I was playing with him, while he was on my chest. But about 18, I can't remember, he was young. And I remember thinking, I know him better than I've ever known anybody in my life. And he probably knows me better than anybody has known me because I was just playing and being genuine. And it occurred to me, we've never exchanged a word because he can't talk yet. And you can really get to know somebody just by play. And then the final little factor of this is presence, just showing up for people. And I had a student at Yale, Jillian Sawyer, who lost her dad, and she was at a wedding with a bunch of her friends. And when the father-daughter dance came, she just knew she would never have a father-daughter dance. So she went to the restroom for a cry, and when she got out, all her friends there were in a row. And she described in one of her papers for me of the moment, "What I will remember forever is that no one said a word. I'm still amazed at the profoundness that can echo in silence. Each person, including the newer boyfriends who I did not know, gave me a reaffirming hug and turned and headed back to their seats. No one lingered or awkwardly tried to validate my grief. They were just there for me, for a moment, and it was exactly what I needed." And so that's just a beautiful case of accompaniment. So that's the second skill. The next skill, and the most important skill in getting to know someone, is being good at conversation. Now, a person is a point of view. Each person has their own unique way of seeing the world. Aldous Huxley famously said, "Experience isn't what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you." Each of us, things happen to us. We take what we've learned, our ethics, our values, our histories, our traumas, our pains, and we construct it into our own unique way of seeing the world. Each of us sees the world slightly differently. And if I want to know you, I have to know how you see the world. And so how do I do that? I can't imagine my way in. I have to have a conversation with you. I have to ask you. And so I have had a series of conversations with conversation experts. And I've asked them, how do you become a good conversationalist? And I shared a bit of this last year, but I'll go through a few of these things again, just because I think they're useful tips to make us better at this moral skill of conversation. Some of them are, treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If you're going to pay attention to someone, make it 100% or 0%, not 60%. Be a loud listener. I have a friend, my wife and I have a friend named Andy Crouch. When you're talking to him, it's like you're talking to a charismatic church. He's like, preach, preach, amen. He's just a loud listener. Love talking to that guy. Make them authors, not witnesses. People don't go into enough detail when they tell you a story. Where was your boss sitting when he said that to you? And then they begin narrating a story. Don't fear the pause. This I got from an improv comedian. If I'm talking to you and my conversational statement starts on my shoulder and goes to my fingertips, at what point have you stopped listening so you can think of what you're going to say next? Probably here. Let me talk to the end of the fingertips. Don't fear the pause. Don't be a topper. If I'm telling you I have a problem with my son, don't then you say, "Oh yeah, I get it, I'm having a problem with my son too." It thinks like you're relating to me, but really you're just telling me you don't care about my son, you care about your son. So don't be a topper. Find the disagreement under the disagreement. When you disagree with somebody, find the philosophical things that causes the disagreement. And these are all ways of being better conversationalists. If some of us were just at John McWhorter's group, panel, a an hour or so ago. He was confronted by somebody who really disagreed with him. And I've learned that when those conversations get hard, especially across power inequality, the most important thing you can do is stand in their standpoint. Say, what am I missing here? I'm not going to shift the conversation back to my frame. I'm going to stand in your standpoint. It's a way to show respect. And I've learned from some conversation experts that in conversation, respect is like air. If it's present, nobody notices. If it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. So you got to show that respect. So that's the third moral skill. The fourth is asking questions, asking the right questions. Questioning is a moral skill. Now, kids are phenomenal at asking questions. I have a friend named Niobe Way who teaches 8th grade boys in New York how to be an interviewer, how to be a journalist. And the first time she ever did this, she said to her classroom of 8th grade boys, ask me a question, I will answer it honestly, whatever you want. First question was, are you married? No. Are you divorced? Yes. Do you still love him? She said yes. Does he know? Do your children know? So like they were going for the juggler. Like those kids know how to ask questions. We lose these skills as we get older because we don't want to ask big questions because we think it's too personal. But I guarantee you, people love being asked big questions. So I collect big questions. What crossroads are you at? At every moment, we're probably at some transition. So what crossroads are you at right now? What would you do if you weren't afraid? How does fear run in your life? If we met a year from now, what will we be celebrating? Can you be yourself where you are and still fit in? And so these are all good questions. There's a guy named Peter Block who asks great questions. You got to get to know somebody before you ask these questions, but what are you committed to that you no longer believe in? What's the gift you currently hold in exile? What's the no or refusal you keep postponing? And so we refrain from asking these questions. My wife makes fun of me because one of the questions I like to ask is, how do your ancestors show up in your life? We're all formed by our ethnicity, and my wife thinks that'll be socially awkward at dinner, but I don't know where she is. But I think I asked that question once at dinner. We all went around and talked about our ancestors. Yeah, I thought it was a great dinner. And I think she agreed finally. And so you'll think people will find it invasive, none of your damn business. So I'm a journalist. I've been interviewing people for 40 years. I ask people who do this for a living, who ask people personal questions, how often do people say none of your damn business? I can tell you the answer is 0. If you ask people questions and show respect about their life story, they love to tell you their story. No one ever asks them. And many of them have had no experience. So asking questions is the next gift. That brings me to the 5th moral skill, and that's storytelling and story listening, leading life as a story. There's a guy named Jerome Bruner, who was a psychologist, who said we have 2 modes of thinking, paradigmatic and narrative. Paradigmatic is like a legal brief or, frankly, a newspaper column, making an argument. Narrative is telling a story. We live in a culture that's paradigmatic rich and narrative poor. We have these Sunday shows, these news shows, the political shows, and we have a politician comes on, we ask a bunch of canned gotcha questions, and they give a bunch of canned responses. Suppose the host just said, tell me your story, how'd you get into this? It would be a more interesting show and we'd have better politics. But we don't go there. I have a friend, David Bradley, used to hang around here. His great skill is to hire people. He's founded free companies, he's really good at that. And he has a method he calls Take Me Back. He says when people tell their story in a job interview, they start with their career, and he says, no, take me back to your childhood. His theory, I don't know if I agree with him on that, is that we all have our high school anxieties still sitting around inside of us. So he wants to know about your high school experience. And so I met a guy named Dan McAdams, who is a narrative psychologist at Northwestern. He asks people to come in to the lab, pays them $500 for their 4 hours of time, and says, tell me your life story, high points, low points, turning points. Then at the end, he hands them the check, and they say, don't give me the money. This was the best afternoon I've had in years. And so just elicit stories. And so when I'm listening for stories, first thing I'm listening for is who's the hero here? We all have different kinds of heroes that we think we are or want to be. The survivor, the caregiver, the warrior. I'm probably the searcher. I'm the searcher in most of my stories. What's the plot here? There are only 7 or 10 plots that recur in literature. Overcoming the monster. Some people, their life story is I battled alcoholism, I overcame the monster. Some is rags to riches. I started out poor boy from the other side of the tracks. I made it in America. A lot of people, and I think I do this, redemption stories. I grew, I suffered, I came back better. And we Americans, by the way, tend to tell deprivation stories. And then who's the main character? One day Will Smith was on a set with Viola Davis, and he asked her who she was. Who's the kernel of who she was, the kernel of her story? She didn't quite get the question. So Will Smith said, look, I'm always going to be the 15-year-old boy whose girlfriend broke up with him. That's always going to be me. So who are you? And Viola Davis said, I'm the little girl who would run home after school every day because the boys hated me because I was not pretty, because I was black. And we all have these experiences that are core to who we are and carry over how we go through life. Which brings us to the final skill I'll mention, which is empathy. Empathy is involved in every stage of getting to know somebody, but a lot of people don't really understand what empathy is. Well, they think of it as just like open your heart and gush. But empathy is actually 3 different skills. The first skill is mirroring. It's being able to catch the emotion of the person in front of you. And to be able to be good at that, you have to know a lot about emotions. Some people lack what the scientists call emotional granularity. They can't tell the difference, like when your kid screams at you, I hate you, Mom. They don't really hate you, they don't know the difference between hatred and anger. People with high emotional granularity who have read literature, who have reflected on their emotional experiences, have high emotional granularity. They can tell the difference between anger, frustration, pressure, stress, anxiety, angst, and irritation. They're like painters with a lot of different colors on their palette. They're emotion experts. The second skill of emotionality is, if the first one is mirroring, the second is mentalizing. It's to be able to look at you and say, I had something similar like that happen to me. I remember my first day on the job, and I know you must be having a lot of mixed emotions, excitement, intimidation, fear, imposter syndrome, and that's projecting your own experiences onto another. And then the third skill is caring. Con artists are really good at reading emotions, but they don't care. And so it's the ability to show care. And so if I want to show care, if you give me a gift, the egocentric thing to do is to write you a thank you note saying, here's how I'm going to use my gift, the gift you gave me. The empathetic thing to do is, here's how I appreciate the motivations that drove you to choose that gift. So it's not about my experience, I understand your experience. Now, so I've listed these skills to emphasize that morality is not this big, heroic thing. It's knowing, it's every day, and it's skills. And so I've spent the last couple of years now writing a book that's coming out in the fall called How to Know a Person, which is about this process of becoming a better person by being a lot better at making other people feel seen, heard, and understood. And so I've spent these years on the lookout for moments when somebody does this exceptionally well. And so like a friend of mine told me about his daughter was in 2nd grade struggling, and one day the teacher said to her, you know, you're really good at thinking before you speak. And that one comment turned the girl's whole year around, because what had been, she had thought it was her social awkwardness. It turned out to be, oh, teacher sees that in me as a strength, seeing something in her that she didn't even see herself. When I heard that story, I was reminded of my 11th grade teacher, Mrs. Dewsnap. I made some smart-ass comment, and she, in front of the whole class, she said, David, you're trying to get by on glibness, stop it. And I, on the one hand, felt humiliated in front of the whole class. On the other hand, I thought, wow, she really knows me. And so I ran across this in a book on Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson was a freshman congressman, he went to see Franklin Roosevelt in the Oval Office, and after like a 10-minute meeting, Franklin Roosevelt turned to his aide, Harold Ickes, and he said, you know, Harold, that's the kind of uninhibited young pro I might have been as a young man if I hadn't gone to Harvard. In the next couple of generations, the balance of power in this country is going to shift to the South and West. And that kid, Lyndon Johnson, could well be the first Southern president. Pretty insightful. And so that's wisdom. You know, we think of wisdom as like the ability to be Yoda to deliver wise maxims. But to me, wisdom is the ability to witness your story, take the anecdotes and the rationalizations we all tell, and just sit with it and receive you. And it's about that process of receiving you, helping you clarify what you really want, helping you change your relationship to the past, sort of dredging up the baggage of your clean tail. And that's wisdom. It's not being a smartass in front of a podium. There's a writer named Parker Palmer who wrote, "Every epistemology becomes an ethic. The shape of our knowledge becomes the shape of our living. The relation of the knower to the known becomes the relation of the living self to the larger world. Every epistemology becomes an ethic. Every way of knowing another person or seeing the world becomes a way of showing up in the world." And it seems important to me that we be open enough to be open-hearted enough to be this skilled. And that's one of my lessons in life, just to try to be more open-hearted, which is a prerequisite. Frederick Buechner was a novelist who was a little like me, a little closed, a little inhibited. In the middle of life, he wrote, "The trouble with steeling yourself against the harshness of reality is that the same steel that secures your life against being destroyed secures your life also against being opened up and transformed by the holy power that life itself comes from." So he knew he needed to open himself up. And then he concluded later in life, "It is important to tell at least from time to time the secret of who we truly are, because otherwise we run the risk of losing track of who we truly are and become to accept the highly edited version we present to the world. It is important to tell secrets from time to time because it makes life easier and it makes them easier for other people to tell secrets to our own." So being open-hearted is a prerequisite, but it's not enough. Skills. And that's why I keep coming back to those 6 skills. You have to be good at it. And that takes practice and that takes intention. It's like going to theater school. You learn the techniques of acting, but when you're on stage, you're not thinking about them. You've just inhabited those roles and internalized it. So I'll close with 2 final moments of seeing well. One of them I got from a book called Lost and Found by a writer named Catherine Schultz. And Schultz's dad, Isaac, had escaped World War II. He'd been a refugee. He'd come to America. He'd become a lawyer. He was a cheerful, talkative guy, apparently. He was curious about everything from baseball to Edith Wharton, to whether apple cobblers were better than apple crisps. Interesting question. And when they were young, he would take his daughters and instead of reading them goodnight stories, he would make them up on his own. And at the moment when he was supposed to be trying to calm the girls down, he would tell them adventure stories that riled them all up. He sounded like just a great dad. Late in life, he got sick, and when he got really sick, he suddenly just stopped talking. And they couldn't understand it because he was such a talkative guy. And he was sitting there toward the end of his life, and the whole family had gathered around him. And Schultz writes, "I'd always regarded my family as close, so it was startling to realize how much closer we could get, how near we drew around his waning flame. And on one of the final evenings of his life, they all went around in a circle, and each person took turns talking to their father, saying the things they didn't want to leave unsaid, and saying how much he had meant to him, each of them." And Schultz wrote, "My father, mute but seemingly alert, looked from one face to the next as we spoke, his brown eyes shining with tears. I had always hated to see him cry and seldom did, but for once I was grateful. It gave me hope that for what may have been the last time in his life, and perhaps the most important, he understood. If nothing else, I knew that everywhere he looked that evening, he found himself where he had always been with his family, the center of the circle, the source and subject of our abiding love." That's a guy who's died well seen. And so the final story I'll tell happened to me and I guess my wife 2 years ago or so. I'm sitting at our dining room table, and I'm reading some boring book, which is what I get paid to do. And I look up, and Anne walks in the front door, and she pauses in the front door, and it's summertime, and the sun is coming from behind her. And she pauses there, and she looks, her eye rests upon an orchid, which we kept on a table by the door. And she doesn't seem to notice me, but her eyes just absentmindedly rests on the orchid. And a thought flashed across my mind, which was, I know her. I know her through and through. And if you have this with family members or spouses, and if you had asked me what exactly I knew about her at that moment, it wasn't her personality traits, it wasn't the biographical details I'd used to describe her to her neighbor. I felt I was experiencing the whole flowing of her being. The incandescence of her smile, the occasional flashes of fierceness, the insecurities, the lifts and harmonies of her music. And I wasn't seeing pieces of her. What I saw or felt I saw was the wholeness of her. And I had this delicious sensation that I wasn't seeing her. I was almost like seeing out from her. And the only English word I can think of to describe that moment is the word beholding. I wasn't observing her, I wasn't scrutinizing her, I was just beholding and just receiving the glory of another human being. And I can't tell you how delicious that moment felt. And I learned that it's delicious when somebody really gets you and sees you. It's also delicious to be the one who sees. And so we should chase those moments. And they're everyday moments. It's not grand. It won't get you a big write-up in the New York Times. But it is the essence of being a better person. Thanks very much.